The morning of March 12, 1944, is unremarkable at Papago Park, a prisoner-of-war camp built the year before on flat desert ground north of Tempe, Arizona. The air is dry and already warming toward the kind of heat that surprises German sailors used to the cold of the North Atlantic. The camp holds close to 3,000 men, most of them Kriegsmarine crewmen pulled from sunken U-boats, and the prisoners themselves have given it an ironic nickname, Schlaraffenland, the land of milk and honey. There is a theater showing films twice a week. There is a prisoner-run newspaper. There is no forced labor unless a man wants the extra pay. For most of the Germans held here, the war has effectively ended in the most comfortable way a war can end for a captured man. One transfer, arriving today, is about to prove that comfort was never the same thing as safety. Papago Park had been built quickly in 1943. On land, the Army leased specifically for the purpose of holding the wave of German naval prisoners. The war in the Atlantic was producing faster than existing camps could absorb. 4 compounds held enlisted men. A 5th held officers, separated by rank, the way military custom generally required. The perimeter fencing was standard, the guard towers unremarkable, the desert beyond them empty in every direction for miles. To an outside observer, it looked like exactly what it was: a secure, well-run installation holding thousands of men who no longer had any say in how the war around them would end. What that description missed, and what the paperwork inside the camp's own administrative files already understood, was that the population behind that fence was not uniform in its loyalties, and that at least one man about to walk through its gate carried a target on his back that had nothing to do with anything he'd done since being captured. Sonad Sustuituid, a target drawn not on the battlefield, but months earlier, in an interrogation room thousands of miles from the desert he was about to enter. The man being processed into the camp that afternoon is Werner Drechsler, 21 years old, born in the town of Mühlberg in Brandenburg. Drechsler had served aboard the German submarine U-118, sunk off the Azores the previous year, and like every survivor pulled from the water, he had been brought in for standard interrogation by U.S. Navy intelligence. What happened next set him apart from nearly every other prisoner in the system. Drechsler's father, a social democrat, had been sent to a Nazi concentration camp as a political prisoner before the war, a detail that gave Werner Drechsler little reason to feel loyalty toward the regime that had jailed his own family. He cooperated with his American interrogators enthusiastically, more than enthusiastically enough that naval intelligence recognized an asset when they saw one. Rather than sending him into the general POW population, they used him as a plant, placing him inside other camps under a false identity, listening for information other prisoners let slip when they believed they were only talking to a fellow German sailor. It worked for a while. Naval intelligence officers running the program understood exactly what they had in Drechsler, a native German speaker with real U-boat service, capable of moving through a prisoner population and drawing out details that no interrogator in a formal interview room would ever pry loose. He was given a cover identity, Limi, and moved between facilities as needed, listening in mess halls and barracks for the kind of unguarded talk that happens only between men who believe they're safely among their own. For a while, the arrangement produced exactly the intelligence the Navy wanted. But an informant's usefulness has a shelf life, and Drechsler's had already been used up once before, in a previous camp, where fellow prisoners had grown suspicious of him under that same cover name. Naval intelligence knew this. They warned the Army, in writing, to keep Drechsler segregated from other Kriegsmarine prisoners going forward, understanding exactly what would happen if he were ever recognized among men who had served in the U-boat fleet with him. That warning is the moral hinge this entire story turns on. The danger to Drechsler wasn't a mystery discovered too late. It was a documented risk, known in advance, by the very authorities responsible for his safety as a man in American custody. Satuinan foi 22, And on March 12, 1944, despite that written warning, Werner Drechsler is transferred into Papago Park anyway, a camp housing dozens of U-boat veterans, some of whom had crossed paths with him before. If you've followed a story like this one before, you know what this channel exists to do, not just to describe what happened, but to trace exactly how a documented warning got ignored and what it cost the moment it was. Word travels through the compound almost immediately. Several prisoners recognized Drechsler on sight, men who had served alongside him or crossed paths with him in an earlier camp where his cover as an informant had already begun to unravel. By the time the sun goes down, most of the barracks know exactly who has just walked through the gate and exactly what they believe he had done. A senior non-commissioned officer among the prisoners convenes what amounts to an impromptu tribunal that same evening, gathering testimony from men who claim direct knowledge of Drechsler's cooperation with American intelligence, weighing it against the unwritten code of loyalty that binds U-boat crews together, and reaching a verdict without ever summoning Drechsler himself to answer for it. He is convicted in his absence of treason against his fellow prisoners. Less than 7 hours after his arrival, a group of German prisoners, accounts place the number anywhere from 7 to 15, moves on the barracks where Drechsler is sleeping. He is beaten unconscious where he lies, the sound of it muffled enough, or accepted enough, that no guard on routine patrol intervenes in time to stop it. His body is then dragged across the compound in the dark to the camp bathhouse, a squat concrete building used by hundreds of men every day without a second thought, where the men responsible hang him by rope from the shower room rafters, staging the death to resemble a suicide. It does not fool anyone for long. Guards making their morning rounds on March 13th find him still hanging, and even a cursory inspection makes clear that the bruising on his body predates the rope by hours. This was no act of despair. It is, within the fenced perimeter of an American-run prisoner camp, a premeditated murder, carried out by men who understood exactly what they were doing and why. Executing what they believed was a legitimate sentence against a traitor, using a process that bore no resemblance to any lawful court, military or otherwise. For the U.S. Army, the killing of a prisoner inside its own custody is not a matter that can simply be absorbed into the routine friction of camp life. Whatever loyalty code the German POWs believed justified what they'd done. American forces bear a legal obligation under the Geneva Convention to protect every prisoner in their custody. An obligation that had just been violated inside the wire of a secure U.S. facility on U.S. soil, less than 7 hours after a documented internal warning about exactly this risk had gone unheeded. The investigation that follows is not optional. It is, in a very real sense, the United States answering for its own failure to protect Drechsler as much as it is a hunt for his killers. By mid-morning, camp authorities have sealed the compound and begun questioning suspects. A process that moves slowly and yields almost nothing at first. The prisoners close ranks completely, presenting a wall of denials so uniform it is itself a kind of evidence. Even early polygraph examinations, a relatively novel investigative tool at the time, and one American interrogators are still learning to rely on, fail to break the silence running through the barracks. Days stretch into weeks without a single usable confession. The compound continues to function around the investigation almost normally. The theater still shows its films twice a week. The camp newspaper still goes to print. While beneath that surface routine, Army investigators quietly build a list of names drawn from bunk assignments, overheard fragments, and the handful of prisoners willing to speak privately. Out of earshot of the men they still have to sleep near every night. Investigators eventually conclude that breaking the case will require removing suspects entirely from the environment where camp loyalty holds firm, away from the barracks, the shared meals, and the code of silence that a closed prisoner population can maintain almost indefinitely as long as its members remain together. On May 3, 1944, 20 POWs identified as possible participants are transferred out of Papago Park to a secret interrogation facility near Stockton, California, isolated from the rest of the camp population and, just as deliberately, isolated from each other, subjected to sustained individual questioning using techniques the Army keeps classified even in its own internal reporting. Separated from the collective pressure that had kept every man silent inside the wire at Papago Park, the account each prisoner gives in isolation begins, slowly, to diverge from the version they'd all agreed to tell together. The confessions build over the following weeks, one prisoner's account corroborating another's, gradually reconstructing the entire sequence of that March evening. The recognition in the barracks, the improvised tribunal, the assault, and the hanging in the bathhouse. The investigation formally concludes on June 20, 1944, 2 weeks after the Allied landings at Normandy, with a recommendation that 7 prisoners face trial for murder: Helmut Fischer, Fritz Franke, Günther Kuhlsen, Heinrich Ludwig, Bernhard Rüber, Otto Stenger, and Rolf Visui. 2 additional non-commissioned officers, Siegfried Elser and Friedrich Murza, are recommended for lesser charges as accessories before the fact. Men believed to have organized the impromptu tribunal itself, though the case against them ultimately never proceeds to trial. There is a name in the historical record connected to Papago Park's culture of hardline Nazi loyalty that deserves mention here, even though he is never formally charged in the Drechsler case: Korvettenkapitän Jürgen Wattenberg, one of the camp's senior and most committed officers, whom later researchers would suspect of having quietly encouraged the killing without ever putting himself at direct legal risk. Wattenberg's story doesn't end with Drechsler. 9 months later, in December 1944, he would mastermind the largest German POW escape of the war, 25 men tunneling out of Papago Park through a passage the prisoners had disguised as an excavation for a volleyball court. The 7 defendants are brought before a general court-martial, prosecuted by the Judge Advocate General's office, with lead prosecution work handled by Lieutenant Colonel Leon Jaworski, a Texas-born Army lawyer who would go on, decades later, to a career defined by pursuing accountability at the very highest levels of American government. In 1945, though, his job is narrower and no less serious, proving, before a military panel, that 7 prisoners of war had conspired to execute a fellow prisoner without any lawful authority to do so, regardless of what code of honor they believed justified it. The defense argument, raised in various forms by each of the 7, rests on the claim that Drechsler's cooperation with American intelligence made him a legitimate traitor under German military law and custom. That what happened in the bathhouse was an act of wartime discipline, not murder, and that the men responsible believed themselves bound by a duty higher than the rules of an enemy prison camp. The prosecution's answer is direct. None of these men held any legal authority, German, American, or otherwise, to convene a tribunal, render a verdict, or carry out an execution inside a facility governed entirely by United States military law. Whatever Drechsler had or hadn't done, the power to judge him belonged to lawful authority alone, not to an ad hoc gathering of enraged bunkmates in a barracks after dark. The court-martial moves with unusual speed relative to many war crimes proceedings of the era, in part because the confessions gathered at Stockton leave little room for factual dispute. Under the Geneva Convention, the United States is obligated to notify the protecting power representing German interests, neutral Switzerland, of any death sentence handed to a German prisoner, along with a waiting period before the sentence can be carried out. That notification goes out through proper diplomatic channels exactly as the convention requires, even for men convicted of murdering a fellow German prisoner. The panel finds all 7 guilty. The sentence handed down is death by hanging, and unlike many wartime military sentences that are later commuted or reduced on appeal, this one is carried out in full once the required notice period has passed. On August 25, 1945, just weeks after Japan's surrender formally ends the war, Helmut Fischer, Fritz Franke, Günther Kühlsen, Heinrich Ludwig, Bernhard Rüber, Otto Stenger, and Rolf Wiswy are hanged at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. It remains, to this day, the largest mass execution ever carried out by the United States military at one time. 7 men put to death together for a killing that took place inside an American-run camp meant to hold and protect them. Werner Drechsler's own story closes quietly, and later than most. His body, unclaimed by family for 2 years, is finally given an honorable military burial at Fort Bliss, Texas on June 17, 1946, a formal acknowledgement, however delayed, that whatever judgment history renders on an informant's choices, the United States still recognized an obligation to bury him with the dignity owed to a man who had died in its custody. He rests today at Fort Bliss National Cemetery, alongside other German servicemen who never made it home. His grave marked the same as any other soldier's, with no notation of the controversy that surrounded his death, just a name, a date, and a row of identical stones stretching out beside him. The case itself did not simply close with the executions at Fort Leavenworth. In the years that followed, historians and researchers returning to the trial transcripts found themselves drawn back to the same unresolved question that had shadowed the proceedings from the start. How much responsibility belonged to the 7 men who were hanged, and how much belonged to the officers and intelligence handlers who had known the risk and moved him into harm's way, regardless? The court-martial had answered the legal question cleanly enough. Murder without lawful authority, carried out by named individuals whose confessions left little room for doubt. What it never fully answered was the administrative failure sitting quietly behind the killing itself, a written warning, filed and apparently set aside, that had specified almost exactly what would happen if it went unheeded. What makes this story different from most in this format isn't the crime or the punishment. Satte betrayal, sananan. Both are documented plainly enough in the trial record. It's the warning that came first. American naval intelligence knew, in writing, that placing Werner Drechsler among Kriegsmarine veterans carried a specific and foreseeable risk, and transferred him into exactly that danger anyway. The 7 men who acted on that opportunity paid with their lives for taking justice into their own hands inside a system that had already failed, in its own quiet way, to protect the man they killed. Both facts are true at once, and the record, court-martial transcripts, investigation files, burial documents, preserves all of it, unresolved and unsoftened, exactly as it happened. That's the piece of this story worth sitting with when it's over. Not just who was punished, but how thoroughly the system that punished them had also failed the man whose death started the whole process. 7 men went to the gallows at Fort Leavenworth for a killing that had unfolded almost entirely in the dark. In under 7 hours, inside a camp built to hold 3,000 prisoners with names, ranks and case files on every one of them. And one 21-year-old sailor, informant or not, traitor or not, went into the ground 2 years later at Fort Bliss, with a marker no different from any other soldier's. The last quiet acknowledgement that the rules protecting a prisoner in American custody were never supposed to depend on whether anyone liked the choices he'd made to survive the war he was captured in. If stories like this one, the ones with no clean villain and no easy ending, just a documented sequence of failures and consequences, are worth your time, that's exactly what this channel exists to keep doing. There's more of them.